Join us on an excursion through history to the beautiful gardens of Afton Villa, a majestic place. It is this quality that endures even though the villa itself was destroyed by a fire in 1963 and only the gardens remain.
In 1790, this was part of a Spanish land grant, and there was a very simple house just behind me on that where the grass is there, a typical Louisiana colonial house, 4 rooms down, 4 rooms up, with an outside staircase. And to this place came a family named Barrow, B-A-R-R-O-W, part of a very large Barrow family, which migrated here during the latter part of the 18th century as Anglo-Saxon settlers from North Carolina. And they established a veritable dynasty of plantations here in West Feliciana. There's hardly an old house here that a Barrow hasn't slept in or lived in, like George Washington. The one who came here was named Bartholomew Barrow, and he established his family in this simple little 1790 house. And he began to carve out this giant working cotton plantation out of this wilderness. And in 1836, it went to his son David Barrow. And David Barrow became the wealthiest cotton planter here in this Feliciana area. But strangely enough, content to live in this very simple house with his family. In 1846, his first wife died. Her name was Sarah. He buried her in the little family cemetery where you can go and visit. And then a year later, we're told, in 1847, he was down in the old St. Charles Hotel in New Orleans, which has since been demolished, unfortunately. And he was sitting there with his daughter, Mary, and this beautiful young woman swept through the lobby. And he told his daughter, you know, I'm going to meet that young woman and I'm going to marry her. And her name was Susan Woolfolk, and she was from Kentucky, and she was down here visiting her Woolfolk family in New Orleans. She was a beautiful young woman, very, as we say, avant-garde. She wanted everything to be the first and the latest with her. She dressed beautifully. I have a picture of her portrait where she had real jewels on her dress, very imposing. So she was anything but enchanted when she was brought back to the backwoods of Feliciana to live in this simple house. So David, her husband, told us she could build anything she wanted here, provided she left that little house intact for sentimental reasons. You see, it had been his mother's and it had been his first wife's. We're told that they went abroad on their trip to Europe, and just outside of the city of Tours in France, she saw just the house that she wanted to copy. This was at a time when the Greek Revival architecture was passé, the ones that we generally think of as antebellum houses with the columns. Gothic Revival was the prevailing architecture, and she saw this Gothic chateau, castle-like house that she wanted to copy. So she brought her architect and her landscape gardener back with her, and they came to St. Francisville to live. They lived here for 8 years, building this house and laying out these gardens below. Our work began in 1848, and it was finished in 1856. And when she was through, she was true to her promise to her husband that she would leave the little house intact. She just built over it and around it. She had 41 rooms when she finished. This house and Nottoway on the river were 2 of the largest antebellum houses in Louisiana. She lived here on great scale and glamour. She loved giving parties. I have accounts of the many beautiful parties that she had, bringing people up from New Orleans on riverboat and so forth. But you see, she didn't have very long to do this, because it was finished in 1856, and the war between the states was in 1861. They lived here all through the war, Mr. and Ms. Barrow. And federal troops came here twice. One time, the story is that she was in the house with her children and the governess. And the governess said, "Miss Barrow, there's a troop of soldiers coming up the avenue," which you know is a half-mile long, back to the house. And she quickly went all around this house, this three-story house, getting all of the keys. They were Normandy keys, very large, and she put them in a basket. And when they arrived at her front door, she said to the captain, "These are the keys to my house. Just don't destroy it." And he said, "We're not going to harm your house, but we're going to take all the cattle and all of that as contraband." And so they gathered up all of the livestock, and they were going down that avenue. And the man who told me this was a direct descendant of the Barrows. This was his great-great-grandmother. And he said his grandfather was 5 years old, and he followed the soldiers down the avenue. And when they crying, and when they got down there to the front gate, he said, "You have my Shetland pony." And the captain said, "Give the little boy back his Shetland pony." And that was a story that went down in the family. He got the Shetland pony to bring back. And so, although the house was not destroyed, it destroyed the Barrows. They lost everything. And David Barrow died in 1874 during what we called our Reconstruction period. I'm sure that you know about the Reconstruction period. And she buried him beside his first wife, Sarah, along with their children, his mother and father, all of whom are there in the cemetery. And she left and went back to Kentucky, and she's buried in Kentucky. And for a while, for a long period of time, this place was neglected. The house was neglected, the gardens were forlorn, and someone bought it in 1870, around 1880, maybe 1885, and established it as a school for young women. It had a very Victorian name. It was called the Feliciana Female Collegiate Institute, and girls boarded here. And then in 1912, Dr. and Mrs. Robert Lewis from Chicago came through here, and they fell in love with this old place. The gardens were neglected. The house wasn't in too good a shape. It had been used as a school and all that. And Dr. Lewis and Ms. Lewis bought it. And it was Dr. Lewis, who was quite a gardener, who began to propagate by the thousands the azaleas that he found in this old garden, primarily that red azalea that you see that's blooming now. And it was indigenous to this garden, and it's called the Pride of Afton Villa. And it's an Afton Villa red. It's not grown commercially. And it's in here by the hundreds and hundreds all through the grounds. When they left, then the Percys came. Mr. Percy was originally from Greenwood Plantation, and he came over here. He married, her name was Dorothy, Dot, and they lived here. And they did for the house what Dr. Lewis had done for the garden.
Did you tell them the story about how your mother came to have Aftonville?
Oh, that's kind of wild. My father's side of the family was full of very prim and proper, ladylike aunts. You know, his sisters and his grandparents and stuff. And my mother's side of the family was totally different. My grandfather grew up in the Irish Channel, and they were very, very poor. And he became very wealthy in his life. And he had a lot of money, and my mother married a man who was expected to become governor of the state at one time. He was Edwin Edwards' best friend. In fact, Edwin Edwards stood as best man in their wedding. And he and a whole bunch of politicians that you know the names of were in school together, in law school together, and were friends. And then World War II came, and he resigned. He was the youngest legislator to ever be in the house, in the state house. Anyway, he resigned his position and went and joined the army and went to war and was killed in the Battle of the Bulge. And my sister, who is my half-sister and older, she was 2 years old at the time. And my grandfather felt very, very sorry for my mother. Here she was with his 2-year-old daughter and no husband, and he went up to her. She was an only child and pretty spoiled, by the way. Anyway, he went up to her and said, "Is there anything, I will get you anything you want. Is there anything in the world that you want?" And she said, "Well, there's this house." My grandmother said that when the telegraph came, it was in December, and they had gotten the Christmas tree and it was laying on the porch, and they never ever put it up. But before the leaves on the Christmas tree turned green, my mother was moving into Afton Villa. Well, for one thing, it was the biggest house in the parish, and it was the absolute best place to play hide and seek. We had a wing in the back with 5 bedrooms, and so it was great for sleepover. You could fit a lot of people in there. That was upstairs. We lived upstairs, mostly. We had a living room and a long hall that we used as a dining room that had been a porch that was closed in, and we had a kitchen downstairs. And the rest of the downstairs was shown to the tourists, except for what had once been called the quarters, but that's where my grandmother lived. She had like an apartment, a 2-bedroom apartment, my grandmother and my grandfather, and they lived on the first floor. So, but we lived all on the second floor. All our bedrooms were up there. They turned the turrets into bathrooms, because originally, of course, there were no bathrooms. The tourists would come through the house, and if we wanted to go upstairs, we'd have to say, "Excuse me," to walk through the tourists where they were on tour and go upstairs. And we were supposed to wait until they left, but sometimes if we were in a really big hurry, we were allowed to say, "Excuse me," and scamper up the steps. The house was opened 365 days a year. Christmas was the only day we closed. And for Christmas dinner, we invited people over, and that night we had a big dance in the ballroom with the band every Christmas, because that's when we could use the big ballroom. I loved when they had parties to hang out in the kitchen and eat the hors d'oeuvres in the kitchen before they got taken out for the guests. Sometimes when we would get bored, my sister would say, "Let's go play with the tourist." And she would walk up to the tourist and she'd say, "I live here, do you want to take my picture?" But I was too shy to do that. But it was fun talking to them sometimes. They were from all different places and things, and they would get so excited to meet somebody that lived there. That made you feel good, because they thought you were special.
And my favorite story was all the girls were on the boys' shoulders and playing around on the terraces and having a great time. And Miss Woodside's mother, as a joke, lay down on one of the graves and put a sheet over herself. This is true. And as we went running past, we look over there, and there is this apparition coming up from one of the graves, and we started running, we started tumbling, we went all the way down those terraces. It was fun. It was fun. But the pool is definitely, that was my favorite. That was my favorite because it was so beautiful. It was large, but it was extremely beautiful swimming pool, all tiny mosaic.
It was very pretty. And the gardens were very pretty. And I think that living in such beauty gave me something special, you know, a little bit of beauty in my soul that I think will always be there for me, having grown up in such a beautiful place. It took 7 hours for the house to burn down. My father, my mother, myself, my sister, and her husband were in the house at the time. My father was ill, and he's the one that smelled the smoke and alerted everyone. When my sister's bedroom was above the kitchen, and when she sat up, her head was in smoke. She was laying in the bed, when she sat up, her head was in smoke. So it was pretty progressed, you know, before we got out of the house. And once we got down the steps, the fireman wouldn't let us go back up the steps again. I wanted to go back up because I had some blue and some yellow and some red jeans with matching shirts that I really, really wanted, and my wallet with all my school pictures. I didn't get a thing. All I got out was the robe and pajamas and slippers I had on. I had no clothes. And all the pictures, family pictures, burned up. We had no family pictures. It's tough going through a fire. And it was a big loss because it was a whole change of life. Lifestyle changed dramatically after the house burned.
At that time, the volunteer fire department had large sirens stationed around town, and these things kept going off and kept waking me up. And I told my wife, I said, I'm going to see what's happening. I thought it was something like something real serious, which it was, but where this thing kept going off. So I came by the fire station, and Miss Hannah Wood was out by the fire station. I only had one truck at the time, and she was out telling people. When I pulled up there, she said, Aftonville is burning. Aftonville is burning. She was standing out there in her gown and her night robe. And so I came on up here and went inside and started helping get stuff out. And they had all ordered everybody out. And Carter Percy and I stayed in and continued to get stuff out. He had a fire axe. He'd knock doors down, and I'd carry them, haul them out to the back and give them to people, and mantelpieces and just whatever we could get out. And the flickering of the flames and the sparks was flying everywhere. So eventually we came on out, and it just a massive fire. And I went out front and sat around with Mr. Mills. You remember Mr. Henry Mills? That was Miss Dot's father. They were all sitting out there in a wrought iron chair looking at it like it was, something to behold, which it was. And I remember Mr. Mills told Miss Dot, he said, baby, it's been nice, hasn't it? He said. She said, yes. He said, if you want me to, I'll build it back just like it was for you. And of course, that never happened. But that's what I recall about the fire.
The house, everything was left abandoned. She sold it temporarily to someone named Montalvo, Mr. Montalvo, who was in Baton Rouge and who was had invented the icy, which I'm sure you all know the icy thing. He was the icy king, I was told. And his plan, actually, I read in the newspaper, was to tear this down, the ruins down, and build a very beautiful house here to live in. But unfortunately, he was in financial difficulty eventually, and he did nothing between the period of 1963 and 1972. And that's where my husband and I came into the picture. We were both students at LSU and fell in love at LSU. And his family lived in a plantation house in Natchez called Linden. That was where his mother lived and his family. And we would often drive up 61 to visit his family when I was in school. And oftentimes we would come in here. It was open to the public. And I thought it was such a romantic place. This house, you'd make that turn, and it was like a castle with the turrets and towers and so forth. And it always stayed in my mind how beautiful it was. Subsequently, after we finished college, we finished in journalism, the School of Journalism. We went to Chicago to live. We later lived in New York. Then finally we came back to New Orleans, and it was in 1972 when we heard that the house had burned. We were devastated. We hadn't been back here in years. So one hot August day in 1972, when we were going up to Natchez, we pushed the gates open and came in. We could see the place had declined. This was like a snake pit here. No one had ever excavated it. 3 stories had fallen down in here. We did not even know this cellar was here, which was the old wine cellar. We walked around and we could have cried because the garden was in decline, everything. And when we got back to New Orleans, my husband said, well, I know what's going to happen to Afton Villa. Someone is going to buy it, they're going to level it, and they're going to make a giant subdivision. Because out of the thousands of acres that were originally here, there are still 250 acres. And I said, well, wouldn't it be wonderful if someone would buy it, not to build a 41-room house, heaven forbid, but just to save this 19th century garden, where there are very few 19th century gardens left in Louisiana. And before we knew it, we had done it. And thus began, 38 years ago, our efforts to bring back the azaleas, the boxwood parterre, the garden. And in here, where we're sitting now in the ruins, we excavated it and got back to the very perimeter of the garden, of the house rather, where you can see just how the house was laid out. The towers were unstable, so we had to tear those down. But everything else of the footprint of this house, we left. And then we began to plant it as a garden. So many times people come in and they'll say, well, where was the house? And I will say, you're in it. And we've planted here now about 7,000 tulips every year in this part of the garden. And we plant it with different perennials and annuals. We keep it going all through the year. And also on the grounds, the parterre. The gardeners here are very interesting. I have the gateman. I have 2 gatemen there. I have 4 people in the garden working. Ivy Jones is the head gardener. And when we first came, he was very young, 38 years ago. And I was very young too. And my husband said, you know, that Jones boy down on 61 looks like a very nice young man. I'm going to ask him to come up for 2 weeks and help us get some of the vines off of the azaleas. And he's been here for 38 years.
My name is Ivy Jones. I'm the manager of the garden. I was 38 years ago. I was hired for 2 weeks and still here. Well, it's, you know, you don't stay anywhere that long and not care about the place that you work, you know, your job, and I just really care about what goes on here, and I protect it as much as possible.
The other day, I said, you know, Ivy, looking around, in the 38 years that we've been here, things have really changed. And he said, yes, and so have we. So I'll continue to go on and do this, and I love it. I think it keeps me going. I think that's one of the things about gardening. When you're interested in gardening and interested in what God does wonderful things. You know, when you look around and see the wonderful things he does, the changing seasons, it keeps you alive and keeps you feeling young. And I really heartily believe in that. So that's my story.